Court ruling prevents landlord from moving family out to move daughter in. This was an article from CBC from back in June, so I've been sitting on this one for a while, but I knew I wanted to make a video about it eventually. And the Coles notes is that a landlord wanted to move their own daughter into a property that they owned, that they had leased out to tenants. And technically, under the Residential Tenancy Act, this is allowed. There's just sort of a process that you have to go through. However, in this particular case, this was denied, and the family of 6 was allowed to stay in their rental property. So there's a lot to unpack here, and we're going to get into it in this video, and there's a lot of details to go over. But just before I get into it, if you're new here, my name is Andrew Stephens. I'm a realtor in Halifax, and if you want to be educated on the Halifax real estate market, then hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to book a call with me, if you're thinking about making a move in the HRM, or you just want to talk about the real estate market, you can reach out to me anytime in the Calendly link below. Okay, now before I dive into this one, I just want to say, yes, this is a super spicy topic right now. It's been all over the news in general in terms of the housing crisis and all these kind of, rent evictions and ways to get people out and all of that. So I'm going to talk about all that today. It's a spicy topic, but the reality is this is where the housing situation is in Halifax right now, and it sucks. It's crazy that we're even talking about it, but that's why the Tenancy Act is in place. That's why these hearings are in place, is to work through these sort of sticky situations. So keeping it clear and concise, a landlord owns a property. They wanted to move their daughter into this property. Under the Residential Tenancy Act, this is allowed. You're allowed to move yourself or a close family member into a property. So think yourself, think a sibling, think a child, think a parent. That's kind of what that means in terms of a tight-knit, close family member. Now, there's a process that you have to go through. This landlord would have had to serve the tenant with a certain form. And then once that happened, then usually it sparks a hearing. And if that hearing was successful, then that tenant would be given usually around 60 days from the start of the following month to get out. But in recent cases, I've heard of them giving a lot longer, anywhere from 90 days up to even 6 months, depending on the situation, how much they're paying for rent, how hard it's going to be for them to find another rental, and all these kinds of factors are usually considered in these hearings, especially now with the overall housing situation in Nova Scotia. So in this particular case, this eviction was denied. The tenant has been there since 2011. They're paying very cheap rent based on today's standards of $900 a month. It's a family of 6. So these were all major factors that were cited in the decision of why this eviction was denied. And the adjudicator actually said right in the decision that terminating a tenancy when a family may have no safe place to move is something that this court will try to avoid. One interesting part to me about this whole case is that it says right in the decision that unlike a lot of these rental disputes, this one was done in good faith. It was very courteous. And that's interesting to me because to me, this is a big factor. It says in the decision that everybody's thought process was that the landlord was acting in good faith and that it was their idea the whole time they've owned this unit that they were eventually going to move their daughter into the unit. So I think that's a big factor here because I feel like I would be feeling very differently if I thought this landlord was being kind of a slumlord and trying to work the system to get a tenant out just to get a higher renter in there. And I'm not saying that that hasn't been happening. No doubt it's been happening a lot. For example, a landlord will say they're moving a family member in, sign an affidavit and all this, and then not move them in, or maybe they move them in for a month and then they get them out of there and they get a new tenant in. And this is kind of their way around the rent cap, right? I've seen this happen a ton. I've heard of this happening a ton. But in this particular case, it says that it is believed that everybody was operating in good faith, which again, to me, is a huge factor here of whether this eviction should have been allowed or not. The decision states that the owners should have the option to use the property as they see fit, and their intention to transfer it to their daughters should not have been thwarted unless there is a strong public interest, the adjudicator wrote. However, he decided that maintaining things as they are was the most appropriate action, pointing to a number of factors, such as the size of the family. The decision actually says 6 people in a 3-bedroom unit makes greater use of a space than a couple living there with a regular visitor. The current rent of $900 a month was another factor, and the current shortage of housing and the hurdle of finding affordable housing for a family of 6 was another big factor here. The decision also explained how accommodations are more than just a place to live, recognizing the roots and connections to the community. Some quotes from the decision are: childcare is relatively close and local schools is significant, he acknowledged, adding that the importance of proximity to friends and where they play sports. Being such long term tenants also weighed in their favor. They have security of tenancy, the decision states. Over 13 years, they've had a single home, and it's the only home that their 3.5-year-old daughter has known. An legal aid lawyer who commented for the CBC article stated, "It's not enough for somebody to show that there's good faith intention and that they want the unit for a family member. It really considers the individual factors and it shows that these cases need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis." Okay, so that's the story, that's the situation, and obviously it's sort of a pretty sticky one. So on one hand, you have this tenant who's paying $900 a month. I have no idea what their financial situation is, whether they could afford, a rental at today's kind of rental rates that we're seeing out there. And maybe they could, maybe they couldn't. But regardless, it's going to be very difficult for them to find a rental that works for their family, especially if they want to stay in a particular school zone. It's a family of 6. Financially speaking, they're going to be paying minimum at least double what they are paying right now. It's almost impossible to find affordable units, especially with enough bedrooms for a family like this. And then on the other hand, you have the landlord, and they own the property. And as per the Tenancy Act, they're supposed to be able to move a family member in there. And now apparently they can't. So they cannot do what they want with a property that they own, that they bought with their own hard-earned money. So for context, this is what the Tenancy Act says about these particular types of evictions, where the landlord in good faith requires possession of the residential premises for the purpose of residence by himself or a member of his family, or the director deems it appropriate circumstances. So simply put, the director deemed that it was not appropriate to kick this tenant out. They had a decision to make, and I get how they got there, and they made it. They sided with the fact that it would have been more harmful to this family to kick them out than it would be to have the daughter go find some new housing for her and her partner. So at this point, I think, again, I would be feeling very differently about this if it didn't mention that all this was believed to be done in good faith and that there was nobody trying to, be greasy and go around the rent cap or anything like that. This was a case of courtesy, and it seems like everybody was on the same page and everybody was just trying to do the right thing for themselves and their family. At the end of the day, with this situation, I'm assuming that if these tenants were kicked out of this property, that they'd probably be, for lack of better words, screwed, or it really affect their financial situation. And right now, these tenants have been there since 2011. So my thought would be that this mortgage payment is pretty cheap, meaning that if the daughter was going to move in, they could probably live there for somewhere around, $1,000 a month to $1,500 a month, all in with expenses and utilities and everything. However, now that daughter is going to likely pay $2,200, maybe $2,500 a month, depending on where they end up. And my point is this: yes, it is really crappy to have this tenant kicked out of that property. I would never, ever argue against that. It's a really crappy situation overall. But at the same time, this landlord owns the property. They bought it with their hard-earned money at one point or another years ago. And is it really such a bad thing if they want to move their daughter into this property to help them out, just like every other struggling young professional out there trying to get into the housing market? Is it really that bad of a thing to want to move their daughter in to help them out and get them off on the right foot as they're young professionals trying to pave the way for themselves? And personally, it's a really, really difficult situation. It is what it is. But at the end of the day, somebody's losing and somebody's winning. And that's just kind of the reality of this housing situation currently. Overall, there's going to be a lot of varying opinions on this topic, no doubt. And I'm anticipating the comment section getting kind of spicy on this one. But, these situations are difficult. The act is in place for a reason. The whole hearing process is in place for a reason. Personally, I don't agree with this decision, although under the circumstances, it probably was the right decision to make, but it doesn't mean that I agree with it. And I'll follow it up by saying that I really feel for tenants right now. I really feel for the overall housing situation. It's a complete train wreck. But at the end of the day, I think this sets an interesting precedent going forward for similar situations like this that are going to be going to tenancy hearings in the future. It's my belief that if you're a property owner, that you should be able to use that property for your own personal use or your own personal use for your family if that is what you desire to do. You are, in fact, the owner of the property. Now, in this particular case, I would never say this family should be out in the street in 60 days as like the standard kind of notice. I think they should be given a lot more time, and I think there has to be some things in place to help them find new housing. And the reality is that's just a really, really tough ask right now. So I think they should have been given a lot more notice, but I do not think this should have been denied. And no, it doesn't make me a monster. It doesn't make me a bad person. Look, there's a lot of things that are going on right now with the housing situation that are not great. And this is one of them. And I'm not saying that they should have, bent the law or anything like that. These evictions are a rule within the Tenancy Act, and they are allowed, and it is part of the act. So I'm not saying go against that. I'm saying that in a situation like this where it's obvious that the landlord is acting in good faith and they're actually going to use the property for the reasons they say they're going to, that this should be allowed, and there should be some kind of meet in the middle with a timeline of how long it's going to take to get that tenant out of there, and it needs to work kind of for both parties. But the reality is no timeline to get that tenant out of there right now is enough. You could give them a year. It's still not going to be possible for them to find a 3-bedroom or more rental for $900 a month in the Halifax area right now. Whenever I see things like this in the news, I always think about, how is this going to be going forward? So how is this case going to be used in reference to future cases, and how is it going to tie in, and how many more of these evictions are going to be denied or allowed based on kind of the outcome of this particular decision? So for example, let's think about my own life. What if, so I have a personal house and I have a couple rental properties. And before you jump down my throat, no, I don't get the actual market rent. They're very, very fair rents, and I'm not a slumlord. So let's say that my fiance and I separated and we sold our personal home. And then let's say it was my plan personally to move into one of the rental properties. Would this particular eviction potentially be denied because I have a tenant living there? Let's face it, I own the property. And let's say the open market situation for me to get a rental is, $2,500 a month or something like that for like a 2-bedroom rental. And let's say my rental property would only cost me maybe $1,800 a month or $2,000 a month because I've owned it for quite some time. So the mortgage is, a little bit lower than it would be today. Should I put myself in a worse financial situation? Should I be forced to be in a worse financial situation personally just because I have a tenant living in a property that I own? So that's one particular case right there, that something like that could be another example of how this plays in to the landlord versus tenant situation, and when a landlord's personal situation changes, how this kind of a situation might affect them. What if I had an elderly parent who I wanted to move into a rental property? I wanted to move them maybe close to me. Maybe this particular rental property had a good setup for them. Maybe their health is declining very rapidly and I need them close to me. And financially speaking, it makes sense as well. Should that application have any possibility of being denied? Serious question. What if I have a rental unit that I've owned for a long time that effectively is costing me maybe $1,000 or $1,200 a month, and I have a child who's going to DAL, and the only other rental options are $1,800 a month or $2,000 a month? Should this type of eviction application be denied? It really, you see where I'm going here. And I understand that these situations are getting more difficult and more difficult as this housing situation across the province progresses. These decisions previously were a lot more straightforward, I would say. And I think that as the housing crisis has evolved and the overall housing situation has, gone downhill, it's made these situations a lot more gray, and it's made these hearings a lot more interesting in terms of, how the adjudicators are going to deal with them. And truthfully, I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of these in the news coming up, because I think you're going to see a lot of people starting to try to use their own rental property because of the overall housing situation. often, especially people who are trying to maybe downsize from their current home or help their young professional kids out, or maybe aging parents or anything like that. Some of those examples I gave earlier to me are very real life examples that people are going to be dealing with. And these things are going to be going through these tenancy hearing processes far more often coming down the pipeline in the future. These situations are really not fun to see. They're not fun to talk about, but I think they're important conversations to have. And I think it's important for people to think about these types of things as they might find themselves in these situations one day personally. But, it's not really fun to look around at the housing situation and to accept that this is where we're at. It's not really fun to see more and more people struggling. And it's not fun to think about the idea that this likely is not drastically going to improve anytime in the foreseeable future. Because again, like I've talked about in a lot of other videos, we have a huge housing shortage right now. We're adding 8 people to every 1 unit of housing that we're building. We're adding over, 30,000 people a year to the province and only building about 4,000 housing units a year, at least for the 10-year average last 10 years. So yeah, this is not likely to get better anytime in the foreseeable future. Now, if you're still here watching, you obviously have some vested interest in this topic. And I'm curious, do you think this eviction should have been allowed, or do you think they made the right decision? And again, I know it's a very tough one, but I'm curious to know what you think. Drop it in the comments below. And if you got any value out of this video, and if you want to continue being educated about the Halifax real estate and rental market, don't forget to hit that like button and hit that subscribe button, and that'll help push this out to more people like you who may be interested in seeing content like this about the real estate market. And until next time, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your support, and have a great day.